The apartment was silent, but it was a heavy, pressurized silence that made the air feel thin. It was 3 a.m. I stood in the hallway, my weight shifting just enough to make the floorboards groan underfoot. The sound echoed, sharp and intrusive, cutting through the stillness like a blade. I froze, waiting for a reaction. I took another step, then another, my pulse drumming against my throat. I had spent 2 years learning the rhythm of this home. Every shadow seemed to stretch further than it should. I reached the study door. A thin, jagged sliver of light escaped from the gap. I stopped. My hand hovered over the handle, trembling slightly. The dread was not a thought. It was a physical weight. I ignored it. I tightened my grip on the cold metal of the door handle, took a breath that felt far too loud, and pushed. The door swung inward, revealing the sliver of light widening into a harsh, sterile glow. I stepped over the threshold. Min-ho sat at the desk, his back a rigid line against the dim light. He did not turn. He did not acknowledge the door swinging open. On the screen, lines of code cascaded in a rapid, rhythmic pulse of blue light. These were not the clean, structural blueprints of an architect. They were complex, jagged strings of data that seemed to vibrate against the dark glass. I stood paralyzed in the doorway, my eyes straining to make sense of the patterns. It looked like a language I had never seen, a series of commands designed to breach or to hide. The room smelled of ozone and stale coffee. I took a half step forward, the floorboards silent this time, and the movement caught his peripheral vision. He did not jump, he did not gasp, he simply reached out with a fluid, practiced motion. His fingers hovered for a fraction of a second over the keys, then slammed the lid down. The click was sharp, metallic, and final, convinced small room like a gunshot. The blue glow vanished, leaving us in the sudden, suffocating dark. He remained seated, his hands still resting on the closed lid, his posture tense and unmoving. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was absolute. I moved around the desk, my feet dragging slightly on the rug. I needed to see his face. I needed the familiar warmth of the man I had shared a bed with for 2 years. As I rounded the corner, the desk lamp cast long, distorted shadows across his features. He didn't look up. He didn't offer a glance or a word of comfort. His jaw was set, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. I reached out, my hand hovering just inches from his shoulder, but I pulled it back. The air around him felt cold, detached, as if he were encased in glass. I looked at his hands, still gripping the edge of the closed laptop. They were the same hands that had held mine in the bookstore, yet they seemed to belong to someone else entirely. I waited for the flicker of recognition, the small, gentle smile that usually signaled he was ready to talk. It never came. He was a statue, a hollow shell of the man I thought I knew. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow to the chest. I was standing in the same room as my husband, yet I was utterly alone. The man sitting before me was a stranger, a ghost, inhabiting a life I no longer recognized. I took a step back, the distance between us suddenly feeling like an unbridgeable canyon. I backed out of the study and into the hallway, my breath hitching in my throat. I needed to remember who I was before this house, before the silence, before the lies. I stopped in front of the hallway mirror. I saw Ellena Stone, 32 years old, staring back. My skin, the color of deep mahogany, caught the dim light of the corridor. I touched my face, tracing the line of my cheekbones, and ran my fingers through my short, tightly coiled hair. I was a French woman, born of a different world, who had crossed oceans for a fresh start. I had arrived in Seoul with nothing but a suitcase and a hunger for something new. I remembered the early days, the thrill of navigating a city where I was a complete outsider. I had learned to find my own way, to build a life from scratch, in a place that spoke a language I was still struggling to master. I was not a ghost. I was not a performance. I was a woman who had built a career and a home through sheer persistence. The man in the study was a stranger, but I was not. I stood straight, squared my shoulders, and took a steadying breath. I was Ellena Stone, and I was still here, anchored by my own history, not by the man who had spent 2 years pretending to be my husband. I closed my eyes and forced myself to picture him as he was when we first met. Min-ho, 35 years old. He moved with a calculated grace that made every action seem deliberate. His features were sharp, clean-cut, and symmetrical, as if he had been sculpted to fit into any room without drawing suspicion. He possessed a lean build that carried the weight of his presence with ease. Every morning, he stood before the mirror and meticulously adjusted his charcoal suits, ensuring the fabric sat perfectly against his shoulders. He never left a button undone or a crease out of place. It was a performance of absolute control. When he spoke, his voice remained steady, pitched at a frequency that invited trust. He maintained a posture that suggested he was always listening, always attentive, always ready. I watched him navigate social circles with that same precision, his movements fluid and efficient. He was the picture of stability, a man who seemed to have mastered the art of being exactly what the world expected. I see now that it was a calculated design, a mask. The memory of him was not always cold. It started in a small, cramped bookstore, tucked away in the back streets of Itaewon. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the sun hangs low and heavy, pouring through the front windows in thick, golden shafts. Dust motes danced in the light, suspended in the warm, stagnant air. The smell of old paper, vanilla, and binding glue filled the narrow aisles. I remember the silence of that shop. It was a soft, paper-muffled quiet that felt like a sanctuary from the frantic pace of the city outside. I was standing in the corner, looking for a translation of a classic I had read back in France. The shelves were packed tight, reaching all the way to the ceiling. I stood on my tiptoes, reaching for a spine that sat just out of my grasp. My fingers brushed the edge of the cover, but it slipped, sliding further back. I let out a frustrated breath, shifting my weight, ready to give up and find a ladder. That was when the light shifted. A shadow fell across the shelf as someone stepped into the aisle behind me. I turned, and there he was, standing in the golden glow. He did not say a word at first. He simply reached past me, his arm extending in one fluid, controlled motion. His hand closed around the spine of the book I had been chasing. He pulled it down with a slight, rhythmic scrape against the wood. He turned his head, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. The sunlight caught the side of his face, softening the sharp lines. He held the book out, his fingers steady, not a tremor in his grip. His voice was low, pitched to cut through the hum of the city. "This is the one you were looking for," he said. The sound of his voice was calm, devoid of the frantic energy. I took the book. The cover was cool and smooth under my fingertips. He did not step back immediately. For the first time since I had arrived in this city, the pressure in my chest eased. I looked at the book, then back at him. He offered a slight nod, his expression neutral but attentive. It was a simple gesture, yet it anchored me to the floor. That afternoon in the bookstore was not an isolated event. It became the foundation of a 2-year rhythm. Seoul was a labyrinth of neon signs and rapid-fire Korean that often left me stranded in the middle of a subway station, unable to read the maps or catch the nuance of a conversation. Min-ho became the translator for my life. When I struggled to negotiate a lease for my apartment, he arrived with a folder of documents and spoke to the landlord, until the terms changed in my favor. When I felt invisible in the crowded markets of Gwangjang, he steered me through the throngs, his hand firm on my elbow, guiding me to the stalls where the food was fresh and the vendors knew his name. He taught me the shortcuts through the back alleys of Itaewon and the quietest parks along the river where the city noise finally dropped away. He was the constant in a life that felt like it was constantly shifting under my feet. For 2 years, he was the only thing in Seoul that stayed exactly where I expected him to be. The shift did not happen with a shout or a confrontation. It arrived in the quiet spaces between our sentences. For 2 years, the dinner table had been a place of exchange, where he would recount the day or ask about my work. Then the questions stopped. He would sit across from me, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from his bowl, his movements mechanical and precise. I would mention a project or a conversation I had at the gallery, and he would offer only a brief, perfunctory nod. He stopped asking about my plans for the weekend. He stopped suggesting the walks along the Han River that had become our ritual. The apartment, once filled with the sound of his voice explaining the city to me, grew cavernous and still. I found myself watching him from the kitchen, waiting for him to look up, to offer that familiar, steady gaze. He remained motionless, his focus entirely elsewhere. The air in the room felt thick, as if the oxygen had been replaced by something denser. Even when we sat in the same room, the distance between us felt like miles of empty space. The silence in the living room soon became a prelude to his new routine. It started on a Tuesday. I was reading on the sofa when he stood up, his phone gripped tightly in his palm, and walked toward the bathroom. He closed the door, the latch clicking into place with a finality that seemed too sharp for a simple trip to the sink. I heard the muffled drone of his voice through the wood, low, rapid, and urgent. It was a cadence I had never heard him use. He was not speaking in the measured, calm tones he reserved for me. He sounded like a man negotiating, or perhaps reporting. I waited for him to emerge, but 5 minutes stretched into 10. When he finally stepped out, he did not look toward me. He went straight to the hallway, his face tight, his eyes avoiding the living room entirely. The next night, he did it again. Then, again. The trust that had been my foundation for 2 years began to fray, replaced by a cold, sharp curiosity that kept me awake long after he had turned off the lights. The city outside our window was a sea of millions, yet I had never felt more solitary. I stood in the center of the living room, the air thick with the quiet of the apartment. The realization of my isolation had shifted into a cold, driving need for clarity. I turned toward the wall of shelves that spanned the length of the study. Minho had spent years curating this collection, every spine perfectly aligned, every title a testament to his intellect. I stepped forward, my breath hitching in my throat. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the leather-bound volumes. My hands were shaking, a fine, uncontrollable tremor. I began to pull the books away from the wall, one by one. I checked the gaps behind them, my fingertips tracing the rough wood. I moved with a frantic, desperate rhythm, sliding books aside, checking the weight of each one, and peering into the dark corners. The dust clung to my skin, but I didn't stop. I felt like an intruder in my own home, searching for the crack in his facade. My fingers brushed against a thick, leather-bound volume near the bottom shelf. It stood out, not by its title, but by the way it sat slightly recessed from the others. I gripped the spine and pulled. It came away with a hollow, scraping sound that echoed in the quiet room. I held it in my palms, testing its weight. It was far too light for its size. My pulse quickened, the rhythm erratic and sharp. I turned the book over, my thumbs finding the seam where the cover met the pages. I pried the front board back. The interior had been meticulously carved out, the paper edges glued into a rigid, rectangular cavity. My breath hitched. A sudden, cold jolt of adrenaline surged through my veins, sharpening every sense. The smell of old paper and stale adhesive rose from the void. This was not a book. It was a container. It was a deliberate, calculated space, carved out of history to hide something from me. I stared at the dark, empty space inside, the realization settling into my gut with the weight of lead. I stood frozen, the hollow book open. I reached into the dark, rectangular void. My fingertips brushed against something cold, hard, and unmistakably synthetic. It was not paper. I hooked my index finger around the edge and pulled. A small black device slid out, heavy and dense, landing in my palm with a dull thud. It was a burner phone. The surface was smooth, devoid of any markings or buttons. I held it there, the plastic cool against my skin, my thumb hovering over the power key. The screen was a void, a dead black mirror reflecting nothing but the dim light of the study. I felt a sudden, sharp spike of terror, a physical tightening in my chest that made it hard to draw breath. Yet, beneath the fear, a grim curiosity took root. I turned the device over, feeling the slight weight of the battery pack. It was a relic of a life I knew nothing about. A digital shadow hidden within the pages of a fake history. I stared at the blank screen, waiting for it to betray its purpose. The silence in the room seemed to press against my ears, amplifying the sound of my own ragged breathing. I pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, casting a harsh, pale glow across my palms. There were no missed calls, no texts from a lover, no intimate exchanges. Instead, a series of time-stamped logs filled the display. I tapped the most recent entry. It opened to a report, written in cold, clinical language. My breath caught as I read the first line. It was a detailed account of my movements from 3 days ago. The report tracked the exact time I left the apartment, the route I took to the market, and the duration of my conversation with the florist. Every detail was there, stripped of context. I scrolled down, my thumb trembling against the glass. Another report detailed my visit to the library, noting the titles of the books I had browsed. There was no warmth, no affection, only the mechanical observation of a target. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm. This was not a record of a marriage, it was a surveillance file. I was being watched, documented, and analyzed by someone hired to follow my every step. I dropped the phone onto the desk. The plastic clattered against the wood, a sharp sound that echoed in the sudden stillness. I stood up, but the floor felt unstable, as if the foundation of the apartment had shifted beneath me. I looked at the bookshelves, the framed photos, the soft rug under my feet. Every object I had once considered a piece of our life together now looked like a prop in a staged performance. I reached out to touch the edge of the desk, but my hand recoiled before making contact. The wood felt alien, cold, and suspicious. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the man who had held my hand in the bookstore with the architect of this surveillance. The lines blurred. Was the kindness a tactic? Was the laughter a script? I walked to the center of the living room, spinning slowly, searching for a single truth in a room full of lies. The air felt thin, suffocating. I realized then that I had been living in a cage built from his promises, and the walls were closing in. My reflection in the darkened window looked like a stranger, someone I no longer recognized. The reality I had built for 2 years had disintegrated. The silence of the apartment was absolute, yet my ears strained for any sign of movement. I stood in the center of the room, the phone still resting on the desk like a live grenade. My pulse was a drumbeat in my throat, erratic and loud. I forced myself to take a breath, but the air felt heavy, thick with the scent of old paper and the lingering smell of his cologne. Then it happened. A sharp metallic click echoed from the hallway. The sound was unmistakable. The deadbolt slid back with a heavy mechanical thud. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm that made my chest ache. He was home. The front door groaned as it swung open, followed by the soft, rhythmic thud of footsteps on the hardwood floor. Each step was measured, deliberate, and terrifyingly calm. I stood frozen, my muscles locked, unable to process the speed of his return. The distance between the hallway and the study seemed to vanish in an instant. I heard the rustle of fabric as he moved toward the living room. The sound of his keys jingling against the hall table snapped me out of my paralysis. I lunged for the burner phone. My fingers were slick with sweat, and the small device skidded across the mahogany surface of the desk, nearly clattering to the floor. I caught it midair, my heart leaping into my throat. I shoved it deep into the hollowed-out book, jamming the pages shut with a force that made my knuckles white. I didn't have time to check if it was hidden well enough. I slammed the book back onto the shelf, my hands trembling so violently I had to press them against my thighs to keep them still. I spun around, scanning the room for any other evidence of my intrusion. The desk was clear. The chair was pushed in. I took a ragged, shallow breath, forcing my lungs to expand slowly, deliberately. I walked to the center of the living room. I stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind my back, and waited for the shadow to appear in the doorway. Minho stepped into the living room, his presence filling the space with an immediate, suffocating weight. He did not look at me at first. He moved to the coat rack with the same fluid, practiced grace he had displayed for 2 years. He unbuttoned his outer layer, his fingers moving with a precision that felt surgical. I watched the way he hung the fabric, the way he smoothed the shoulders, his back turned to me as if he were alone in the room. He turned slowly, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying stillness. There was no fatigue in his eyes, no sign of the day's work, only a hollow, polished neutrality. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the absence behind his gaze. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't ask about my day. He simply stood there, hands resting at his sides, waiting for me to speak. He tilted his head, a slight, calculated movement that made my skin crawl. He was not the man I had known. The silence stretched, thick and unyielding. We stood on opposite sides of the rug, a distance of 6 feet that felt like a canyon. I watched his hands. They remained perfectly still at his sides, devoid of any nervous twitch or natural tremor. He was waiting for me to break, to fill the void with questions or pleas, but I refused to give him that satisfaction. I took a step forward. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, a sharp sound that echoed off the walls. He did not retreat. He did not lean in. He simply shifted his weight to his left foot, his eyes tracking my movement. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a mundane sound that underscored the absurdity of our standoff. I moved again, closing the gap until I was within reach of the coffee table. My pulse drummed against my throat. He was still watching me, his expression a blank slate. I stood my ground, my feet planted firmly, and prepared to shatter the silence. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and felt the cold, hard edges of the hollowed-out book. My fingers gripped the spine, the leather worn smooth from years of handling. I pulled it out, the weight of it suddenly immense in my palm. I did not hesitate. I stepped to the coffee table and set the book down. The sound was sharp, a hollow thud that cut through the room like a gunshot. It landed squarely in the center of the polished surface, a dark, rectangular intrusion. I did not pull my hand away immediately. I kept my fingertips pressed against the cover, feeling the grain of the material, grounding myself in the reality of the object. I looked up. Minho had not moved, but his gaze had dropped. He stared at the book, his eyes fixed on the evidence of his own deception. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, pressurized, and filled with the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations. I held my breath, waiting for the facade to crack, for the mask to finally slip, but he remained a statue, anchored to the floor. I waited for a flinch. I waited for a tightening of his jaw or a sudden dilation of his pupils that would signal a breakdown of his composure. Seconds ticked by, measured by the relentless rhythm of the wall clock. Minho looked at the book, then slowly lifted his head to meet my eyes. His expression remained a void. There was no flicker of shame, no shadow of regret, not even the slightest ripple of surprise. He looked at me with the same clinical detachment he might use to inspect a piece of architecture. It was a terrifying absence of humanity. I searched his face, desperate for a crack in the mask, but found only a smooth, impenetrable surface. He did not blink. He did not lean away from the truth I had laid bare. Instead, he stood there, his posture relaxed, his hands hanging loose at his sides, as if the revelation of his betrayal were nothing more than a minor, inconsequential detail. The lack of remorse was sharper than any shout or denial. He was not struggling with the weight of his actions. He was merely observing my reaction to them, waiting to see what I would do next. The silence stretched, pulling taut like a wire about to snap. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the architecture of a lie. Every shared meal, every quiet evening, every gentle touch, it all dissolved into a singular, hollow point of origin. There was no apology coming. There was no defense to be mounted because he felt no need to justify a performance that had already served its purpose. I realized then that I had not been living with a partner, but with a ghost. My pulse slowed, not from relief, but from the numbing cold of absolute clarity. He stood there, perfectly still, his presence occupying the room with a terrifying, artificial grace. I scanned his features, searching for the man who had helped me in that bookstore. But he was gone. He had never truly existed. The deception was not a single act. It was the foundation of our entire history. Every memory I held dear was tainted by the knowledge that he had been watching me, reporting on me, calculating the value of my life against a debt I did not even know existed. The air in the room felt thin, drained of oxygen by the sheer scale of the betrayal. I stood before him, yet I felt miles away, watching the collapse of a world I had built on sand. He finally moved. It was a slow, deliberate pivot that felt like the turning of a heavy machine. He did not look at me as he walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window. His footsteps were silent on the hardwood, a rhythmic pacing that echoed the steady, uncaring pulse of the city outside. I watched his back, the way his shoulders remained perfectly squared, untouched by the gravity of the moment. He stopped inches from the glass, his hands clasped behind him. Outside, the Seoul skyline was a frantic, electric grid of neon. Pink, blue, and harsh white light bled through the glass, washing over his face in shifting patterns. I stepped closer, my own shadow stretching long across the floor, but he remained anchored to the view. When he finally turned his head just enough for me to see his profile, the city lights were trapped in his eyes. They flickered there, cold and artificial, reflecting the same restless, hollow energy that fueled the streets below. I stood in the center of the room, the distance between us feeling like an unbridgeable canyon. The air was heavy, stagnant, and tasted of ozone and old dust. I drew a long, slow breath, forcing my lungs to expand against the crushing pressure in my chest. My heart was a frantic drum, but I willed it to slow, counting the seconds in the rhythm of the city's distant, muffled hum. I needed to be steady. I needed to be present. I watched the back of his head, the way he held his neck rigid, as if bracing for a blow that he knew was coming. Every muscle in my body was coiled, ready to either shatter or stand firm. I waited. The silence was no longer a void. It was a physical weight pressing against my skin, demanding a resolution. I shifted my weight, the floorboards beneath me remaining stubbornly quiet. I was no longer the woman who had walked into this study, looking for comfort. I was a witness to my own life being dismantled. I kept my eyes fixed on him, refusing to look away, refusing to blink. The space between us tightened, the oxygen thinning until every inhalation felt like a conscious effort of will. I was ready. I was waiting for the final truth to spill out, for the last thread of the performance to snap. He exhaled, a sound that carried no regret, only the finality of a closing door. His voice was steady, stripped of the warmth I had spent 2 years memorizing. He did not turn to face me. He kept his eyes on the glass, watching the city pulse beneath us, as if he were discussing the weather. "I am not an architect," he said. The words hung in the air, flat and hollow. He gestured vaguely toward the desk, toward the blueprints and the drafting tools that had defined our life together. He pushed a stack of papers off the surface with the back of his hand, watching them scatter across the floor like dead leaves. They were just paper. They were just props. He told me that every late night he spent at the office, every project he claimed to be finishing, was a fiction. He had never designed a building in his life. The career I thought he had, the stability I thought we were building, it was all a stage set constructed to keep me from looking too closely at the man standing in the center of it. He turned his head then, his expression unreadable, showing me the face of a stranger who had been living in my home. The foundation of our life dissolved. He didn't stop with the lie about his career. He walked to the center of the room, his movements precise, almost mechanical. He spoke of numbers that made no sense to me, of debts owed to people who did not accept apologies or delays. He was not just hiding a failed career. He was running from a financial abyss that had been chasing him for years. This apartment, this life we built, it was never a home. It was a safe house, a temporary shelter designed to keep him invisible. He paced the small perimeter of the study, his footsteps echoing against the hardwood. He explained that every credit card, every loan, was tied to a deadline. The walls that held our photos and our memories were merely barriers against the people coming to collect. He looked at the door, then back at me, his eyes devoid of the affection I once saw there. He was a man cornered by his own choices. I wasn't his partner. I was his cover. The air in the study felt thin, poisoned by the truth of his survival. I expected him to talk about money, about the people hunting him, but he shifted the focus back to me. His voice dropped, losing its frantic edge and becoming terrifyingly clinical. He told me that the debt was only half the story. The rest was an assignment. He had not met me by chance in that bookstore. He had been waiting for me. He explained that my family's history, the secrets buried in my lineage, had made me a person of interest to his creditors. He had been instructed to get close, to infiltrate my life, and to monitor every interaction I had. The air in the room grew heavy. He listed dates, places, and conversations I thought were private, proving he had been documenting my life since the day we met. Every dinner, every weekend trip, every quiet moment of intimacy was a data point for his handlers. He wasn't just a man in trouble. I looked at his hands, the same hands that had reached for that book on the shelf, and realized they were tools of a trade I never knew existed. I stood frozen, my mind racing through 2 years of shared history, stripping away the warmth I had once attributed to his touch. Every kiss, every lingering look, every time he held my hand during a walk through the city, it was all a performance. I remembered the way he would tilt his head when I spoke, a gesture I once thought was genuine interest. Now, I saw it for what it truly was, a diagnostic scan, measuring my reactions, gauging my openness to his influence. He hadn't been listening to my dreams. He had been cataloging my weaknesses. The steady hands that had helped me reach that book in the bookstore were not helping me, they were securing a position. I replayed our quiet evenings on the sofa, the way he would pull me closer during a movie, and felt a wave of nausea. Those moments were not anchors of affection. They were tactical pauses in a long-term operation. He had perfected the art of the gentle smile, a mask he wore to keep me from looking too closely at the man behind the facade. I looked at him now, standing in the dim light of the study, and realized he wasn't even a person to me anymore. He was a series of calculated inputs and outputs, a machine designed to extract information from my life. The truth did not arrive as a thought. It struck like a physical impact to the chest. My lungs seized, refusing to draw air. The room tilted, the edges of my vision blurring into a dark, suffocating grey. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold surface of the desk to steady myself, but the wood felt alien, like a surface I had never touched before. Every heartbeat hammered against my ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm that echoed in the silence of the study. I tried to speak, to demand an explanation, but my throat was tight, locked by the sheer weight of the revelation. The walls of the apartment seemed to pulse inward, shrinking the space until I could barely stand. I stumbled back, my heel catching on the edge of the rug, and I had to brace my hand against the doorframe to keep from collapsing. The air in the room was thick, stagnant, and tasted of dust and stale secrets. The man standing across from me was a stranger, yet he occupied the space where my life had been built. I looked at the floor, then back at him. The panic began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I looked at the desk, the laptop, and the man who had orchestrated my life as if it were a game. For 2 years, I had played the part he wrote for me, reacting to cues I never knew were scripted, but the script ended here. I felt the floor beneath my feet, solid and real, and realized that my existence was not a variable in his equation. I was not a piece to be moved or a target to be tracked. The silence in the room changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of a secret. It was the quiet of a blank page. I straightened my posture, my muscles uncoiling from the tension. I looked at the window and understood that my life was mine to reclaim. He was waiting for a reaction, but I gave him nothing. I did not need his confession or his apology. I needed only to remove myself. My hands stopped trembling. I took a steady breath and turned my back on the desk. The decision was absolute. I was ready to start my own. I walked into the bedroom, the space feeling hollow and unfamiliar. I pulled a single bag from the top shelf of the closet. The fabric was stiff, unused to the weight it was about to carry. I moved to the dresser, my hands working with mechanical precision. I grabbed only the essentials: a passport, a handful of cash, a notebook. Each item hit the bottom of the bag with a dull, final thud. I did not fold anything. I did not organize. I simply gathered what was mine and left the rest behind. The sound of the zipper cutting through the heavy silence of the apartment was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I paused for a second, my hand hovering over a small trinket on the nightstand, then pulled my fingers back. I did not need it. I hoisted the bag onto my shoulder, the strap digging into my skin, a grounding weight that reminded me of the path ahead. I looked around the room one last time, seeing only walls and furniture, not a home. I turned toward the door, my pace steady and deliberate. The heavy front door clicked shut behind me, sealing the past inside. Outside, the Seoul night was alive, with the hum of traffic and the sharp, biting sting of rain. I stepped onto the pavement, the water soaking through my shoes instantly, but the sensation was grounding. I walked without a destination, letting the rhythm of the city dictate my pace. Every block I put between myself and that apartment felt like a layer of weight falling away. I navigated the labyrinth of neon-lit alleys, ignoring the stares of passers-by. I was no longer an observer in a stranger's life. I was a participant in my own. Hours later, I found a small, dimly lit guest house near the Han River. The room was sparse, smelling of damp concrete and old wood, but it was mine. I set the bag down and stood by the window, watching the bridge lights reflect on the dark water. The silence here was different. I breathed in the cold, damp air, feeling the steady thrum of my own pulse. For the first time in years, the horizon held no traps, only the promise of a sunrise. Morning arrived with a pale, grey light that filtered through the thin curtains of the guest house. I pulled them back, watching the sun climb over the Han River, casting long, sharp shadows across the water. The bridge was already humming with the early commute, a steady flow of movement that felt disconnected from the static, suffocating life I had left behind. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting flat on the worn fabric, feeling the texture of the grain. There was no phone to check, no secrets to guard, and no script to follow. Every decision from this point forward belonged entirely to me. I walked to the small sink, splashed cold water on my face, and watched the droplets trace paths down my skin. The reflection in the cracked mirror was steady. I was not the person who had walked into that bookstore years ago, nor was I the person who had lived in the shadow of a lie. I was simply here. I opened the door, stepped out into the hallway, and walked toward the stairs. The wind whipped off the Han River, pulling at my hair and cooling the skin on my face. I reached the center of the bridge and stopped. Behind me, the city stretched out in a sprawling grid of grey steel and glass, a place where I had once built a life on shifting sand. I watched the traffic flow beneath me, a river of metal and light that no longer held any claim over my choices. I reached into my pocket, found nothing but the key to the guest house, and gripped it tight. The weight of the last few years did not vanish, but it changed. It became a lesson rather than a burden. I turned my back on the skyline. The path ahead was wide and quiet, leading toward the northern hills where the morning mist was beginning to burn away. I started to walk, my pace steady and deliberate. Each step on the concrete bridge sounded crisp and rhythmic. I did not look back again. The city was a memory now, a chapter closed. I focused on the horizon, the rising sun warming my shoulders, and the simple, undeniable reality of the road beneath my feet. I was moving forward. The bridge ended, spilling me out into the waking city streets. Vendors were rolling up metal shutters, the sound of grinding steel echoing off the pavement. I walked past the corner where we used to buy coffee. The scent of roasted beans hung heavy in the air, a familiar trigger that usually pulled me toward the door. I stopped. I looked at the glass storefront, then at the open road stretching toward the district I had never explored. I turned away from the coffee shop. My decision was small, silent, and absolute. I kept walking, weaving through the growing crowd of commuters. They moved with purpose, eyes fixed on their phones or their watches, trapped in their own routines. I felt no urge to join them. I reached the edge of the park where the trees were thick, and the noise of the city faded into a dull hum. I sat on a wooden bench, watching the leaves stir in the morning breeze. My hands were steady. My breathing was deep and rhythmic. The life I had known was a closed book, left behind on a shelf I would never visit again. I stood up, brushed the dust from my palms, and walked into the green shade of the park, fully present in the silence of my own making. The park path wound toward the riverbank, leading me to the quiet guest house I had called home for the last few weeks. I pushed open the heavy wooden gate. The hinges groaned, a sound that felt like the final punctuation mark on a long, difficult sentence. I stepped into the dim hallway. A mirror hung by the entrance, its surface clouded with age. I stopped. I looked at the woman staring back. The exhaustion was there, etched into the lines around my eyes, but the uncertainty was gone. I touched my face, feeling the texture of my skin, the reality of my own presence. I was not a ghost or a performance. I was simply me. I climbed the narrow stairs, my boots clicking against the worn floorboards. I reached the door to my room and turned the key. The lock clicked into place with a satisfying metallic snap. I walked to the window and pushed it wide, letting the morning air flood the small space. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched the light shift across the floor. I was finished with the past. The choice was entirely my own. The sun climbed higher, casting a sharp, golden line across the floorboards of my room. I watched the light move, measuring the passage of time not in hours, but in heartbeats. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, silver key to the apartment I had shared with Min Ho. It felt cold and heavy, a dead weight from a life that no longer existed. I walked to the window, opened it wide, and let the morning breeze catch my face. With a single fluid motion, I dropped the key into the narrow gap between the guest house and the brick wall below. I did not wait to hear it hit the ground. I turned back to the room, gathered my bag, and walked toward the door. The city was no longer a maze to navigate, but a path to claim. I was finally, completely, my own. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of roasted coffee and wet asphalt. I walked past the rows of vendors, their stalls already bustling with the day's trade. Every step felt lighter than the last. I reached the corner of the street where the small bookstore stood, the place where everything had begun. I paused, my hand hovering near the glass of the display window. I looked at the shelves, at the dust motes dancing in the light, and felt nothing. No phantom ache, no lingering shadow of the man I thought I knew. The memory was just a story now, one I had finished reading and finally closed. I pulled my hand back, straightened my posture, and turned away. The crowd moved around me, a river of people heading toward their own destinations. I joined them, not as an outsider searching for an anchor, but as someone who had become her own foundation. I walked toward the river bridge, watching the water churn beneath the steel beams. The sun hit the surface, turning the ripples into shards of light. I didn't look back at the bookstore, or the apartment, or the ghost of the life I had left behind. I kept moving forward, my pace steady, my eyes fixed on the horizon where the city met the sky. I reached the center of the bridge, where the wind pulled at my hair and the roar of the traffic faded into a steady, rhythmic hum. Below, a ferry cut through the dark water, leaving a white wake that stretched toward the distant bank. I gripped the cold metal railing, feeling the vibration of the city beneath my palms. For years, I had measured my worth by the space I occupied in someone else's life. Now, that space was empty, and the silence was not a void, but a beginning. I watched the ferry disappear under the arch of the next bridge, a small vessel finding its own way through the current. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sharp, clean air of the river. The weight of the past had finally dissolved, leaving only the clarity of the present moment. I turned away from the railing and started walking toward the north side of the city. I did not have a map, and I did not have a destination, but for the first time, I knew exactly where I was going. I was moving toward a life that belonged entirely to me. The city lights began to flicker on as the sky deepened, and I walked into the evening, steady, present, and free. The bridge ended, and the concrete path descended into the heart of the district. I moved with the flow of the evening crowd, my boots striking the pavement with a rhythm that felt entirely my own. I passed a storefront window, the glass dark and polished. I stopped. My reflection stared back, sharp and clear. I didn't see the woman who had been waiting for a phone call or watching a door. I saw someone who had survived. I adjusted my stride, pushed off from the glass, and stepped back into the stream of people. The noise of the city, the sirens, the chatter, no longer felt like a barrier. It was the sound of a world that was open. I turned a corner, leaving the main thoroughfare for a quieter side street. The air grew cooler, smelling of rain and promise. I reached the guest house entrance, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped inside. The lock clicked shut. I was home. The room was small, sparse, and smelled of cedar and floor wax. I set my bag on the floor and opened the latch. I pulled out the last few items I had carried from the apartment, including a small notebook I had kept for years. I walked to the wastebasket and dropped it inside. The sound was dull, final. I moved to the window and pulled back the thin curtain. The sky over the Han River was beginning to bruise with the first light of dawn. I watched the horizon brighten, turning the grey water into a ribbon of pale gold. My hands rested on the sill, steady and relaxed. The silence of the room was no longer heavy. It was a blank page. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched the city wake up, seeing the bridges and the towers not as obstacles, but as landmarks in a landscape I was finally free to explore. I took a slow breath, held it, and let it out. The sun crested the buildings, casting a long, warm line across the floor. I stood up, walked to the door, and turned the handle. The day was waiting. I was ready. I stepped out of the guest house and into the crisp morning air. The street was already waking up. A vendor pushed a cart laden with fresh produce toward the corner, the wheels clattering against the uneven pavement. I walked toward him, the scent of roasting coffee and damp earth filling the space between us. I stopped at the stall, pointed to a bag of fruit, and exchanged a few coins for the paper parcel. The metal of the coins felt cool and solid in my palm. The vendor nodded, a brief functional gesture, and turned back to his work. I didn't linger. I walked on, the weight of the fruit in my hand a simple, tangible reminder of my independence. I reached the riverbank path, where the joggers and early commuters moved in a steady rhythm. I joined them, matching my pace to the flow of the city. The water of the Han River caught the light, shimmering as it moved toward the sea. I turned toward the bridge, moving forward into the light. I reached the center of the bridge, where the wind whipped harder, pulling at my hair and cooling the skin on my face. Below, a ferry cut a white wake through the dark water, heading toward the distant docks. I leaned against the railing, the cold metal vibrating with the passage of heavy traffic behind me. I watched the boat until it was nothing more than a speck. The city felt vast, but it no longer felt overwhelming. I looked at my hands, resting them on the concrete ledge, and noticed the lack of tension in my shoulders. The fear that had defined my time in Seoul had evaporated, replaced by a steady, quiet clarity. I pushed off the railing and turned back toward the bustling streets. I didn't look for familiar faces in the crowd. I didn't scan the windows for shadows. I simply walked, my boots finding a rhythm on the pavement. The tall buildings rose up on either side, no longer looming, but framing the path ahead. I took a deep breath of the city air, turned the corner, and disappeared into the morning rush. Fully present, fully independent, and finally, entirely home. The rush of the morning crowd thinned as I moved into the quieter district near the park. I walked past rows of trees, their leaves rustling in the breeze, and found a wooden bench tucked away from the main path. I sat down, feeling the solid support of the wood beneath me. The city noise was a distant hum now, a background rhythm rather than a chaotic roar. I watched a group of children playing near the fountain, their laughter sharp and clear in the morning air. I took a moment to just sit, to exist without the need to plan or hide. The sunlight shifted through the branches, casting moving patterns on the ground. I stood up, brushed the dust from my hands, and turned toward the open road ahead. There were no more ghosts to outrun. There were no more scripts to follow. I walked past the park gates and into the wider street, my stride steady and purposeful. The horizon was wide, open, and entirely my own. I did not look back at the life I had left behind. I kept my eyes on the path, moving forward with every step, fully in control of the story I was writing for myself. I reached the small guest house, the key turning smoothly in the lock. I stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind me, sealing out the noise of the city. The room was sparse, smelling of fresh linen and floor wax. I walked to the window and pulled back the thin curtain. The Han River stretched out below, reflecting the first pale light of dawn. I placed my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of the last few months lift. There was no one to report to, no one to monitor my movements, and no one to perform for. I watched the sky turn from deep indigo to a soft, bruised gold. The bridge in the distance stood firm, a silent witness to the change. I stood up, walked to the small kitchenette, and filled a glass with water. The cool liquid was sharp and real. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window, seeing not a victim of a deception, but a woman who had reclaimed her own narrative. I took a slow breath, turned away from the glass, and stepped into the center of the room. The space was mine. The time was mine. The morning had finally arrived. I stepped out of the guest house and into the crisp morning air. The streets were already waking up. Steam rose from a nearby food stall, carrying the scent of toasted sesame and spice. I walked toward the crowd. A vendor caught my eye and held up a fresh bun. I nodded, paid with a few coins, and took a bite. The warmth was immediate. I kept moving, weaving through the morning commuters without hesitation. I was no longer a stranger in this city, nor was I a ghost in someone else's design. I was simply Ellena. I reached the corner where the main road split, and then turned toward the subway entrance. Every step felt grounded. I reached the platform just as the train pulled in. The journey was mine to define. If you love powerful, real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel. Share and like.